You guys, I'm going rogue today because I want to talk about the book Will of the Many by James Islington, which is the first book that I feel like I've read in a long time that has the world building and the magic and the intrigue that I think rivals the Cosmere. So this video is going to be 3 theories that I gleaned from reading Will of the Many, and the video will include spoilers for everything through the end of Will of the Many. I know that there's a second book out in that kind of hierarchy series by James Islington. It will not include anything from that second book known as Strength of the Few, mostly because I haven't yet read it. To any viewers that are maybe joining for the first time, I love posting my theories and reflections on all things Cosmere, and I want to do similar deep dives for Will of the Many. So with that, let's get into it. Okay, to start, let's do the setup of the actual world building associated with this novel. Essentially, as far as I can tell and what we learn at the end of the novel, is that about thousands of years ago, and I don't know how many thousands, but thousands of years ago, there was one world that was copied into at least 3 different copies. And that was during an event known as the War Against the Concurrence. We basically know nothing about what the concurrence is, or the war against the concurrence was. So all we know is that that was the point in which the world was copied into at least 3 different parts. And those parts, as we learn throughout the novel, are known as the world known as Res, which is where most of the events of Will of the Many are set on, a world known as Obidium, and then a world known as Lokium. There was also some sort of an event following this copying of the world known as the Rending. And again, we know very little about the Rending. We basically learn about it from these shadows that the main character, Vis, encounters. But it seems like what happened during the Rending is that those worlds were isolated from each other. And we know that because the shadows talk about how Obidium, one of those worlds, was sealed. In fact, they say, "I was known as Artemia's cell. I was a traitor to the commandment of isolation. I attempted to gain synchronism and remove the seal to Obidium during the rebellion of the 7th era of the Rending. I have thus been lawfully condemned to servitude, guiding those who come after." What it essentially means is that the worlds were some sort of government or power was keeping those 3 worlds that were copied isolated. And that kind of isolation, the event that kind of confirmed the isolation, as I understood it, is known as the Rending. Since then, it appears the seal between the 3 worlds has held, mostly. In fact, the shadows that I'm calling the shadows that Vis encounters as he runs the labyrinth kind of show how there are generations of people that tried to break the seal and failed. But it seems like something really changed about 100 years before the events of the book. And that was the event known as a cataclysm. Now, this is another event that we know very little about, but what clearly seems like happened was some sort of cataclysmic event that destroyed a lot of the knowledge in the pre-cataclysmic era. And so a lot of what we see in the book, in terms of what's happening around us, is people and powers trying to rediscover the knowledge and the powers associated with that pre-cataclysmic era. So that's where we start. There's a main character known as Vis, who doesn't know any of this backstory. He's existing on what he thinks is his world, known as Res. He was an orphan, and he was an orphan but because his parents, who were essentially the royal family of an island known as Zeus, were killed when the kind of ruling power known as the hierarchy attacked it. He's been in hiding since then. He takes on kind of a fake name. His true name was Diago, and he takes on the fake name of Vis. And eventually he gets kind of like almost like discovered by one of the senators associated with the hierarchy, who sends him to a school known as the Academy. And so the book is about his time in the academy as he tries to sort of make his way through all of the machinations happening around him and stay true to himself and his ideals. The ruling power, known as a hierarchy, is upheld by this like kind of complex system of will, where you can cede your will, or you're somehow if you're kind of like an ordinary person, you're essentially compelled to cede half of your will to others who then use that will for, it seems like, strength or kind of other powers that enable them to rule. So it's very much a hierarchical or pyramid structure. So with that, let's jump into my 3 theories. I'm going to assume that you've read the book and like understand the plot, so I'm not going to like re-talk through any of the plot lines. I'm just going to jump into the theories. And the first theory is that there are people on Res, the main planet, that are world hopping between Obidium and Lucium, and that ability is giving them immense power. In fact, cataclysmic power. There's essentially this huge explosion that takes place at an event known as the Naumachia, where Vis, like the main kind of protagonist of the story, like saves the day. And that explosion is caused by somebody known as Melior or Estevan. As Vis is like sort of heroically saving the day from that explosion, he notices something really important. He notices that Melior or Estevan is like creating this explosion by somehow like imbuing the air around him. And then there's a warping around him, like he's kind of like fading in and out of existence 100 times a second. And then when Vis touches him, as he kind of approaches him, he feels everything flicker and he has this like impression of a different world. It's a different world with like this black, massive pyramid and a harbor with a bridge that's lined by statues and these like kind of towering waves. And we don't know where this is or kind of what this impression is, but I think it's like very reasonable to speculate that potentially that's an image that he briefly has of one of those 2 other worlds, Obidium or Lucium. And I think what I glean from that is that Melior or Estevan is basically like somehow being in like world hopping in and out between Res and another world, maybe Obidium, and that is somehow enabling him to like have this immense power that he's using to blow stuff up. I think that might be a form of something that is kind of alluded to throughout the text known as synchronism. Synchronism is sort of like framed. It's mentioned here and there as like Vis tries to make sense of like what happened in the past. But what it seems like is basically like the opposite of like duplication, i.e. the opposite of like having multiple copies across worlds, but somehow bringing them together. That's what those shadows say as a reminder. They say, I attempted to gain synchronism and remove the seal to Obidium, which makes me think that that's exactly what Melior or Estevan has successfully done, and that's the power that I think the ruling hierarchy wants. Like, it's that power of synchronism, and as a result, this like kind of insane power to like bullshit up. We learn, or Vis learns throughout the book, that the military, one of the ruling factions on Res, has basically cut a deal with Melior or Estevan, where they're giving him like ships and weapons and uniforms and all of this stuff for kind of information about this like pre-cataclysmic power. So we think these worlds are split, but there's at least a few people that are somehow bringing them together and stealing the power. This leads me to my second theory, which is that the person that we think is the antagonist of the story is actually kind of the good guy. And that is Veridius, who is the principalist, basically, of the academy. I think Veridius is like, honestly, like one of the most interesting characters that I feel like is in Will of the Many, because he's like, he definitely has like many layers to him. Throughout the novel, he's kind of set up as like the bad guy. The senator that adopts Vis, Ulcisor, I think is how you say it, Ulcisor, definitely has like a serious vendetta against Veridius because he blames Veridius for the death of his brother. And Veridius is just like kind of creepy. Like, he's, at least to me, like he's like overly charming and overly good looking and like very just like suave, it seems like, but in a way where he's clearly hiding stuff. But he says something to Vis at the end where he's like the most, I would say like the most sincere. And what he says to Vis is like, please, Vis, like, please join religion. And then he says, we need your help avoiding the next cataclysm. And I sort of take that at face value because if you assume then Veridius is trying to avoid the next cataclysm, like if you believe that, then a lot of what he's done throughout the book, you can kind of explain through a somewhat benevolent lens, even if it's like a little bit like ends justify the means kind of vibe. He's definitely trying to do his best to ensure that this like pre-cataclysmic power or this ability to access other worlds is confined or contained, certainly from the military and potentially maybe from the Anguis as well. And that's because that kind of the main gate to access these worlds is located in an island known as Solovagus that Veridius really does like tightly control. In fact, at one point, somebody kind of acknowledges this. They say Veridius will bury the dome before he allows anyone else near it. So it's possible that he understands that like the magnitude of the power isn't trying to prevent it from getting into the wrong hands, or at least what he perceives to be the wrong hands. The second thing that makes me think that Veridius is like a little bit more benevolent is that entire like precept that underlies like old Caeror's hate for him, which is this idea that he killed his brother, is actually, I think, false. That brother's name is Caeror, and I feel like it's safe to argue that Veridius and Caeror are kind of were and are in cahoots with each other still. Their backstory is that they were friends while they were at the academy, close friends, and they were clearly like starting to investigate or had investigated and found out about this gate and kind of the existence of other worlds. And while Caeror disappears, and what we learn is that he somehow made his way to Abydium through potentially, I assume, through that gate, Veridius, back in Res, makes it his life's work to protect that gate or that portal. When Veridius was a student in the academy, he was supposed to join military and have this like really prestigious post, but instead he sort of like abruptly shifted gears and joined religion and basically like became the head of the academy. And when Vis meets Caeror at the end of the book in Abydium for the first time, the first thing that Caeror asks is, "Did Veridius send you?" Basically implies that he's been waiting for Veridius to send him assistance to Abydium for the last, like, essentially, I think what is like basically 15, 20 years. And conversely, I think there's a really interesting note at the end of the book when Veridius is speaking to Vis and he asks him, did you get help? Did you receive any help getting out? Basically like getting out of Abydium or Lucium. And Vis says yes. And Veridius has this small, irrepressible smile flickering on his face, which, again, like on both sides of the equation, it really seems like they were students working together. Caeror seems like he somehow made his way to Abydium and is waiting for Veridius's help, and Veridius has made it his life's work to help. They really do seem like in cahoots with each other, which is the opposite of what Caeror thinks. I also think that Veridius helps Vis more than he realizes. And specifically that Veridius really helps Vis rise up through the academy. To understand that, I think we have to understand like another major revelation that Emissa, who is like Vis's girlfriend and then tries to kill him, Emissa has been kind of like quietly potentially working for Veridius. The very first time that we meet Emissa, she like sneaks in with a couple of friends while Vis is in a hospital room, and she gives him a glass of water. And Caeror kind of clocks this glass of water, and he says that it might have had a pinch of blackroot or maybe some ground up wolcham, which helps keep Vis off balance and like share more information than maybe he intends to share. And in fact, Vis does end up sharing way more information with Veridius, who arrives later, than he intends to. And so I think that's exactly what Emissa does. She gives him this glass of water, presumably at Veridius's behest, as a way to like open him up. But how does this translate to Veridius actually helping Vis? It seems like it's kind of the opposite. He's like trying to spy on him. And I think it's because as I went through the book, and every single kind of advancement that Vis makes up the ranks from 7th to 3rd, Emissa helps him directly. I want to walk through it really briefly because I do think it's really stark when you put it all together. So for Vis to get to 7th class to 6th, Emissa is the one that tells him, hey, this is what you do. You're nice to your teacher, Feria. If she likes you and you show her you're smart enough, she'll force the issue straight away. And that's exactly what Vis does. To move to 6 to 5, Vis gets a little bit stuck because the teacher, Dultatis, is like kind of has a vendetta against him, like Snape style. But Emissa is the one that kind of gives like the code to crack it. She says, Dultatis has authority over his class. Unless he does something against the rules, his judgment is the only thing that matters. There's an opportunity when Vis essentially ends up dueling another student. And through that course, Vis isn't able to land on like a blow in the way that he should on that student, in a way that suggests like that student, potentially with assistance from the teacher Dultatis, is cheating. And actually, what I think is really interesting about that scene is that it may not be Dultatis. Like, it's implied strongly that it's Dultatis that's the one that's like enabling the student to cheat. But actually, like, Veridius is in the stands as well. And I think it's potentially very likely that Veridius kind of like set up Dultatis to look like he was cheating in a way that would like force Dultatis's hand and force him to make Vis rise up to the next class. Sorry, I feel like that wasn't very clear, but what I'm trying to say is that Vis rises from 6 to 5 because Emissa kind of gives him the clue how to, and then I think Veridius is the one that kind of executes that to actually make it look like Dultatis is cheating. And then quickly then, Vis rises from class 5 to 4, in part because like Emissa explains how he needs to like suck up to the teacher there. And then as he rises from 4 to 3, she like very openly helps in getting another student, Belly, kind of kicked out of 3 so that Vis can take her place. This is a long-winded way of saying that like if Emissa is working for Veridius, which I think she is, then Veridius is essentially indirectly the one that is helping Vis move up ranks. And I honestly like don't fully understand why, but I think it like reinforces this idea that like Veridius may not be like such a bad guy. He has his own machinations that he's doing, all with the intent in his mind of preventing another cataclysm. Okay, and this gets to theory 3 and the biggest one here, which is that Vis's father set this whole thing up. At the end of the book, Vis has this, what he thinks is essentially a dream of between him and his father. And in it, Vis's father like comforts Vis and tells him how proud he is of him, but that essentially that he needs to keep showing courage and keep going. Vis, it's sort of set up like a dream, but actually it's real. It's actually happening. And we know that for 2 reasons. One is because Vis in his dream imagines that he's bound, and when he wakes up, he realizes he actually is bound to the bed. But then second, and perhaps more meaningfully, is that he wakes up and sees a boat that he had carved and given to his father somehow like miraculously show up next to his bedside. And the thing is, like, Vis's father is dead. He confirms that. But what he tells Vis is that death is not death. Death, he says, is a doorway, son. No one is ever truly lost. And I think all of that suggests that somehow Vis's father is still alive, maybe in those 2 other worlds, Abidium and Lucium, and somehow still influencing events and protecting or guiding Vis to whatever destination he needs to get to. There is some weird stuff that happens throughout the novel that suggests that somehow like there's like fate or like external interventions that are guiding what is happening to Vis. For one, the entire circumstances around which Ulquiskor found Vis and adopts him are a little bit weird. The Angwis are claiming that they like tried to set it up in some way, but Ulquiskor somehow got to where Vis was much faster than they even expected. Enough that Ulquiskor eventually says, he says, if I believed in the gods, I would say that they led me to him, i.e. led him to Vis. And maybe it's not the gods, maybe it's Vis's father somehow like interfering from kind of the afterworld. Vis's father, from like what the hints that we learn about him, also seems like he knew a lot more about these other 2 worlds than others do. In fact, it's a little bit of a mystery why the Hierocracy even attacked Seuss and Vis's father. And what Vis's father tells him as they're sort of fleeing is that the reason that's taking place is because they fear what we know. And what we know might be all of this. It might be the existence of pre-cataclysmic power. It might be the existence of the worlds. It might be the ability to take advantage of it. And to bring it back to where I started at the start of this video, Melior, Estevan, is the one person that seems to be able to like tap into this power. And I think it's not a coincidence that he was one of Vis's father's closest advisors. It's also interesting to me that Vis's father had like a few things that he like really trained Vis in, and one of them is to learn the language Vetusian, which really does come in handy for Vis as he's like discovering all of the like pre-cataclysmic era, because everything is written in Old Vetusian. So I think it's entirely possible that Vis's father had this like broader knowledge, maybe foresaw his end and sought to groom his son, and is, even after death, is somehow still engaging in the world to guide Vis. I think there's an element there that is like really quite comforting maybe to Vis, is that even though his father is dead, he's still there for him. But it also suggests that some of what is happening to Vis in terms of him meeting Caeror and in terms of him being put in these like really trying situations are because his father is guiding him and pushing him to war, not peace. So yeah, let me know what you think of these three theories. I feel like Will of the Many is, as I mentioned up front, is like one of the first books I've read in a long time that is has like this world building and like really like intricate storylines that I feel like rivals the Cosmere. But I'll be reading The Strength of the Few next, and so my hope and goal is to like go back and check whether any of these theories were actually true or whether I was like super off base. So thanks everyone. If you like this kind of content, please hit subscribe and like the video. It really helps my channel out. Thank you.